What if the fall of an entire dynasty wasn't caused by armies or swords or even dragons, but by a single kiss? For 300 years, House Targaryen ruled Westeros with fire and blood. They had dragons, crowns, and the kind of fear that makes kings sleep soundly at night. And yet, it wasn't a great army that shattered their throne. It wasn't a rebellion born of ambition or greed. No, what toppled them was something far more fragile and far more dangerous. Love. Or at least, what some called love. This is the story of Robert's Rebellion. A war that turned brothers into traitors, lords into martyrs, and set the stage for everything that came after, from Ned Stark's quiet honor in the north to Daenerys Targaryen's fiery crusade across the narrow sea. A story where every death, every betrayal, every oath broken can be traced back to a single fateful bond between a prince and a girl who was never meant to be his. So tonight, let's step into the ashes of that dynasty and ask ourselves, was it love? Or was it the spark of madness that doomed a kingdom? Before we dive in, hit that like button if you live for the hidden truths of Westeros, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The north? Across the narrow sea? Or maybe, right here in King's Landing? Before passion and rebellion tore Westeros apart, there was an illusion of stability, an empire that seemed untouchable. For nearly 3 centuries, the Targaryens had ruled from the Iron Throne, their dynasty forged in dragonfire. The 7 kingdoms bent the knee not because they wanted to, but because they remembered the dragons that had once blackened their skies. Even without beasts of flame, the memory of fire was enough to keep lords obedient and subjects quiet. To most of Westeros, the rule of House Targaryen felt eternal. 300 years is long enough for fear to become tradition, and tradition to look like destiny. But behind the red walls of the capital, cracks were spreading hairline fractures no one wanted to see. And at the center of it all stood one man, King Aerys II. When he first took the throne, Aerys was not yet the Mad King. He was young, charming, and at least in the eyes of many, a hopeful break from the long shadows of his ancestors. He promised prosperity, and for a brief moment, the court dared to believe him. But promise is a fragile thing in a land where oaths are broken as easily as bread. Over the years, Aerys changed. What began as eccentricity hardened into paranoia, and then spiraled into cruelty. He stopped seeing allies in his lords, and began seeing enemies. Every smile hid a betrayal. Every whisper in the hall was treason. And as his mind fractured, his kingdom followed. Westeros was still standing, but like a great ship with water rushing in beneath the deck. To the common people, life went on as it always had: harvests, taxes, the endless prayers to gods old and new. But at court, silence grew dangerous, and speaking too loudly could be a death sentence. Aerys isolated himself from his council, ignoring advice unless it fed his fears. The small folk never saw this madness directly, but its shadow stretched over them like a storm cloud. Even those closest to him could not escape. His queen, Rhaella, endured his rages in silence, bearing children into a court that smelled of smoke and blood. And his heir, Prince Rhaegar, watched it all unfold with eyes that carried both sorrow and calculation. Many whispered that the prince would someday save them from his father's ruin. But Westeros is a land where salvation rarely comes clean. Rhaegar was destined to be at the heart of the kingdom's unraveling, but not in the way anyone expected. Still, before Rhaegar and Lyanna, before Robert's fury and Ned's honor, there was the slow decay of a throne. And that decay began with a king who feared shadows more than armies. Aerys' paranoia reached its peak after he was captured during the defiance of Duskendale. Humiliated, he returned not as a man, but as something broken, afraid of everyone, trusting no one, and addicted to wildfire as though it were a cure. He ordered pyres to be built in secret. He whispered of burning cities, of cleansing treason with flame, of ruling not through love or respect, but through terror. The lords of the realm stayed loyal out of fear, out of tradition, or out of the belief that the dragon's blood was still sacred. But that loyalty was rotting from within, ready to collapse at the first true spark. And so, while peasants plowed their fields and knights jousted in summer tournaments, the fate of a dynasty balanced on a knife's edge. No one yet knew it, but love, something as fragile as a stolen glance, would prove sharper than any sword. The world of Westeros before the storm was not a land at peace. It was a kingdom holding its breath, trapped under a king who saw enemies in the faces of his friends. That breath would not last long, and when it finally broke, it would shatter 300 years of fire and blood. Every war begins with a spark, and this one came not from steel or politics, but from a meeting of two souls. Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, names that would echo like ghosts through every hall of Westeros. Lyanna was no meek maiden waiting to be married off. She was wild as the northern winds, proud as any Stark, and unwilling to be caged by the expectations of men. She rode horses better than many knights. She carried a fiery temper that clashed with her beauty, a beauty Robert Baratheon swore he would one day claim. But to Lyanna, Robert was a storm she could never tame. She saw the drinking, the women, the hunger for pleasure, and she wanted something else, something deeper. Then there was Rhaegar. Not the brutish warrior Robert was, but a man of music, prophecy, and shadows. He was a prince who could make hardened lords weep with a song. A man who walked through the Red Keep like he carried the weight of doom upon his shoulders. Many said he was melancholy, touched by the same madness that haunted his father. But others whispered that he was brilliant, a dreamer cursed to be born into fire and crown. The stage was set at the great tourney at Harrenhal. It was meant to be a celebration, a gathering of knights and lords under banners of color and song. But history rarely announces itself with fanfare. Sometimes it hides in small gestures that change the world. When Rhaegar won the tourney, all expected him to place the crown of winter roses upon his wife, Elia Martell. It was tradition, a simple act to honor the woman who bore his children. Instead, he rode past her, and in front of the gathered realm, he laid the crown at the feet of Lyanna Stark. Gasps echoed through Harrenhal like thunder. A prince had just chosen another man's betrothed, and in doing so, he set fire to every fragile piece. Some saw romance, others betrayal, but all saw danger. That moment was no longer about a tourney. It was prophecy and passion colliding, a public wound that could not be healed. What happened next remains the greatest mystery of Westerosi history. Did Lyanna go with him willingly, swept away by the songs and the visions of a prince who promised more than duty? Or was she taken, torn from her family, and from Robert's arms in an act of selfish obsession? That question still divides the realm, even long after the ashes have cooled. To the Starks, it was abduction, a crime worthy of blood and vengeance. To Robert, it was theft of the only woman he ever truly loved. But to Rhaegar, perhaps it was destiny. He had long spoken of prophecy, the prince that was promised, the child who would save the world of men. Was Lyanna his chosen mother of prophecy? Or was she simply the object of a tragic desire, caught in the orbit of a man who mistook longing for fate? The truth lies buried with them both, sealed behind stone and silence. But the ambiguity is what makes this story burn even brighter. For every choice that followed, the oaths, the betrayals, the battles can be traced back to that moment of roses at Harrenhal. A moment that still forces us to ask, was this love or the first step toward ruin? And like all great tragedies, the answer may never be clear. What is certain is that with one crown of flowers, the Dragon Prince and the Wolf Maid set the world on fire. Every rebellion needs a banner, but first it needs men willing to bleed for it. And in the North and Stormlands, two young lords were already bound together by friendship and by love for the same woman. Robert Baratheon was everything a bard loves to sing about. towering, broad-shouldered, with laughter that shook the rafters and a warhammer that broke bones as easily as bread. He was passion turned into flesh, a storm given human form. But storms don't ask permission. They destroy whatever stands in their path. To Robert, Lyanna Stark wasn't just a betrothed. She was his heart, his honor, his claim to a happiness he believed was promised by the gods themselves. So when she vanished with Rhaegar, Robert did not see ambiguity or prophecy. He saw theft, he saw betrayal, and he swore to the heavens that he would have vengeance. At his side stood Eddard Starkned, the quiet wolf. If Robert was thunder, Ned was winter, cold, steady, and unyielding. Where Robert dreamed of glory, Ned cared for duty. Where Robert shouted, Ned listened, and where Robert struck, Ned endured. The two had grown as foster brothers in the Vale under Jon Arryn, their bond forged not by blood, but by shared youth. It was this brotherhood that would carry them through fire and ruin. And yet, even Ned could not ignore what had been done to his sister. For the Starks, family is everything, and Lyanna's absence was a wound carved into his soul. Still, unlike Robert, Ned did not crave vengeance for vengeance's sake. He sought justice, an end to dishonor, a restoration of what was stolen. This difference would shape the entire rebellion. Robert fought with fury. Ned fought with grim resolve. One dreamed of killing a prince to avenge his bride. The other dreamed only of bringing his sister home, alive or dead. Around them, lords began to choose sides, but it was these two young men who gave the cause a face. Robert, the storm that would smash a dynasty. Ned, the wolf who would endure its bitter aftermath. Together, they represented the two sides of vengeance, fire, and ice. And in that unity lay the seeds of both triumph and tragedy. For love may start a war, but it is friendship and loyalty that give it the strength to burn. And as the realm would soon learn, when a storm and a wolf howl together, even dragons cannot stand forever. This is the moment where anger turned into open rebellion, the day King Aerys murdered the wolves of the north. Every rebellion needs a spark, but what turns fire into wildfire is blood spilled in front of the whole realm. For Robert's cause, that moment came in the halls of King's Landing, when two Starks rode south and never returned. Brandon Stark, fiery and reckless, demanded his sister's release. He stormed into the capital with the arrogance of youth, certain that justice still lived in the Iron Throne. But Aerys II was no longer a king of justice. He was a king of flames, suspicion, and cruelty. Instead of hearing Brandon's plea, he ordered his arrest. And when Rickard Stark, Warden of the North, came to demand his son's freedom, the king offered only horror. Rickard was bound in chains and suspended above a pyre. Brandon was forced into a strangling device, a cord around his neck, struggling for air. The cruelest twist was that Aerys made the son watch the father burn. Brandon strangled himself to death trying to save him, pulling tighter and tighter until both were gone. It was no execution. It was a spectacle. The king had turned justice into theater, and the whole realm shuddered at the madness of it. What made this crime even darker was who these men were. Rickard Stark was no rebel, no traitor, but the loyal Warden of the North, a pillar of stability in the realm. His murder was a direct insult to every great house, a message that no lord's honor was safe from royal whim. If the Starks could be butchered, then who would be spared? Brandon, too, was more than just a hot-headed youth. He was heir to Winterfell, the bloodline of the first men stretching back thousands of years. By killing him without trial, Aerys cut down not just a man, but the very future of a house that had never broken faith with the crown. In doing so, he awakened the North's oldest, coldest rage. Lords whispered of the old kings of winter, who remembered every wrong for generations. And now, winter itself had been provoked. The shockwaves spread quickly through the 7 kingdoms. In River Run, The Tullys tightened their bonds with the Starks and Baratheons, fearing the madness of the king might soon reach them. In the Vale, Jon Arryn faced a choice: kneel to insanity or defend the wards he had raised like his own sons. His answer would soon echo across the mountains. Even in the south, lords muttered uneasily. If the king of the Seven Kingdoms could roast Rickard Stark alive, what security did a Hightower, a Tyrell, or a Martell truly have? Dorne, already wounded by Elia Martell's neglected court, took the insult personally. Their princess was married to the man who caused this war, and yet their voices were silenced by fire and fear. Aerys believed this cruelty would terrify the realm into submission. Instead, it proved the opposite. It gave Robert and his allies a banner brighter than any heraldry: justice for the Starks. For Robert Baratheon, it was the final proof that war was not only righteous, but inevitable. No oath of fealty could erase what had been done to the wolves of Winterfell. And for Ned, it was personal beyond words. His father and brother slaughtered, his sister missing his family, destroyed before his eyes, without him even being there. Ned's quiet fury was unlike Robert's roaring rage, but no less deadly. The wolf had been forced from his den, and now his teeth would be bared. In the streets of King's Landing, the small folk spoke in whispers. They were too afraid to curse the king aloud, but they remembered the smell of burning flesh. Fear was supposed to bind them, but instead it spread doubt. If the king was mad enough to kill Starks, what madness would come next? Every raven that flew from the capital carried not only the news of death, but the certainty of war. The realm could feel the tide turning, long before swords were drawn. And so, what began as a love story twisted into a political crisis now became something else entirely. With the deaths of Rickard and Brandon, Robert's rebellion was no longer about one woman. It was about survival. What was once the crime of a single prince had now become the madness of a king. And that madness demanded war. Every great war begins not with a single sword stroke, but with a choice here. It was the choice to say no to the crown. When the ravens flew from King's Landing with news of Rickard and Brandon's deaths, they didn't just carry grief. They carried a message. The king had gone too far, and his madness was now everyone's problem. In the Eyrie, Jon Arryn was the first to face the impossible. The crown demanded he surrender his wards, Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark, for execution. But Jon, old and steadfast, had raised them as sons. To give them up would be both betrayal and suicide, and the Vale would never forgive such cowardice. So instead of bending, he broke the silence. He raised his banners against the Iron Throne, choosing defiance over obedience. This was the true beginning of Robert's rebellion, not at Harrenhal, not even in King's Landing, but in the high mountains of the Vale. One man's refusal set the kingdoms on fire. Robert Baratheon was the natural thunder that followed. The Storm Lord roared for vengeance, his hammer ready, his spirit unbreakable. Ned Stark, colder but no less fierce, stood beside him. For him, this was not rage but duty, his house dishonored, his kin murdered, his sister still lost. Together, they became something larger than themselves. They were no longer just wards of the Vale, but leaders of a cause that stretched across half the realm. And soon, the Starks' grief and the Baratheons' fury were joined by the politics of the Riverlands. Hoster Tully saw in this chaos not only danger, but opportunity. The Tullys had long hungered for stronger alliances. By wedding Catelyn to Ned Stark and Lysa to Jon Arryn, he bound 3 great houses together with marriage and steel. Those unions sealed the rebellion with blood and vows. It wasn't just war now, it was family, and family is harder to break than any sword. From the north to the Stormlands, banners began to rise. Wolves, stags, trout, and falcons now shared a single cause: to cast down the dragon. But they were not alone in the realm. Many lords hesitated, weighing loyalty to the throne against the madness of the man who sat upon it. In the Reach, House Tyrell held firm for the crown. They commanded vast armies and fertile lands, making them a pillar of Targaryen strength. In the Westerlands, Tywin Lannister watched and waited. Once Hand of the King, he had grown cold toward Aerys, yet he would not move without certainty of victory. His silence was louder than any speech. The lion was waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. For the rebels, this uncertainty was both blessing and curse. They were outnumbered, but their cause burned hotter than the loyalty of the realm. Their first moves were not sweeping battles, but skirmishes testing strength, drawing lines. The Riverlands became a patchwork of raided villages, shifting loyalties, and brutal reprisals. Robert's hammer struck quickly, his charisma gathering men wherever he went. Small folk loved him, knights admired him, and lords trusted his courage. Ned, quieter, worked to keep the army disciplined. Where Robert inspired, Ned built order, a balance of fire and ice that kept their cause alive. As word spread, songs began to rise around campfires. Some called it Robert's Rebellion, others the War of the Usurper. But all agreed was unlike any war before. It was not just about crowns or borders. It was about love, honor, vengeance, and survival. That mix was far more powerful than any army of sellswords. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Aerys raged and schemed. He demanded loyalty through fire, ordering more arrests and burnings, tightening his grip with every breath. But the tighter his fist closed, the more lords slipped away. Fear could hold a court, but it could not hold a kingdom forever. Rhaegar Targaryen, conspicuously absent, had yet to emerge. His silence was another mystery, one that left the rebels both furious and strangely emboldened. Some whispered he was gathering strength at the Tower of Joy. Others believed he still thought himself a poet, dreaming of prophecy instead of war. Whatever the truth, his absence only fueled the flames. For every day he hid, Robert's legend grew larger, and the rebels' cause more righteous. By the time winter snows touched the Riverlands, the war was no longer a whisper. It was a storm, and it was moving south. Ravens could not keep pace with its fury. One by one, houses were forced to choose, bend the knee to madness or gamble everything on rebellion. And in those choices, the fate of Westeros was sealed. For the first time in centuries, the dragon trembled on its throne. The boy who laughed too loudly, the boy who brooded too quietly, and the lord who refused to betray them, together they had birthed a revolution. It was fragile, desperate, and uncertain, but it was real. The war had truly begun. And no prophecy, no marriage, no bloodline could stop the tide now rushing toward King's Landing. In this section, we witness the rebellion finally gaining unstoppable momentum, a moment when Robert's fury, Ned's strategy, and the shifting loyalties of Westeros began to rewrite history. The first days of the war were tense, filled with cautious marches and testing of enemy defenses. Robert and Ned understood that the crown still commanded respect, and no rash move could guarantee victory. Robert Baratheon moved like a force of nature. Every village he passed, men whispered of the hammer that crushed knights and broke shields alike. Yet it was more than brute strength. He inspired his men, drawing recruits from villages who had never held a sword, and turning them into a loyal, ferocious fighting force. Ned Stark, by contrast, was the calm eye of the storm. While Robert roared across the countryside, Ned organized supply lines, managed communication between scattered forces, and ensured that victories were sustainable. They were a perfect balance, chaos and order, fire and ice too, pillars supporting a rebellion that seemed improbable in size and scope. Where one inspired courage, the other ensured it lasted beyond the first clash of swords. The Riverlands became the stage for the rebellion's earliest major encounters. Skirmishes at small crossings, ambushes near river fords, and strategic raids on supply caravans tested both men's leadership. One particularly fierce clash occurred near the Red Fork, Robert personally led a charge against a royal contingent, shattering their lines and demonstrating the sheer force of his will. News of this victory spread quickly, carrying more weight than the fall of a castle ever could. Banners from neighboring houses began to rise as lords realized the crown could no longer guarantee safety or justice. Yet the royal army was still formidable. Veteran soldiers loyal to Aerys too pushed back at every opportunity, forcing the rebels to adapt constantly. Ned's genius became evident as he implemented coordinated maneuvers. Northern levies flanked, Riverlanders disrupted supply lines, and Stormlander cavalry struck deep into enemy positions. These early victories built momentum, but they were not without cost. Every engagement left scars on the land and on the soldiers, shaping them into a hardened army ready for greater challenges. Beyond the battlefield, the political dimension of the rebellion was equally important. Lords who had hesitated began choosing sides, swayed by the tangible success of the rebel forces and the spectacle of Robert's unstoppable charisma. Hoster Tully's influence became crucial. His strategic control of the river roads allowed the rebels to move swiftly, avoid traps, and maintain supply chains where lesser lords would have faltered. The Vale's support, led by Jon Arryn, further shifted the balance. With mountain passes secured, the Crown's reinforcements struggled to reach key territories, giving Robert and Ned a series of tactical advantages. Even the South, traditionally loyal to the Targaryens, started whispering of change. Merchants, minor knights, and even small lords observed the rise of the rebellion and began to hedge their bets. Every rebel victory was amplified by rumor. A single triumphant skirmish became a story told across the realm, inspiring new men to pick up arms and swelling the rebel ranks. Robert's personal bravery became the stuff of legend. In one encounter, he reportedly smashed through 3 lines of royal knights with only his hammer, his voice booming commands that rallied wavering soldiers. Meanwhile, Ned Stark ensured the army's discipline held firm. Where Robert's bravado inspired, Ned's planning sustained the fight, preventing the chaos of enthusiasm from turning into disaster. The rebels also learned the power of timing. Night attacks, forced marches, and feints became common, keeping royal forces off balance and allowing smaller rebel contingents to win against numerically superior troops. Tywin Lannister's presence in the West added a complicated layer. Though outwardly loyal to Aerys, he watched the unfolding events with a calculating eye, and his caution indirectly helped the rebels avoid certain traps. Communication and intelligence were decisive. Scouts and messengers crisscrossed the countryside, and clever manipulation of rumors kept Aerys' commanders guessing. By the time the summer ended, Robert's rebellion had grown from a coalition of avengers to a coordinated military machine. Banners were unified, troops disciplined, and supply lines secure enough to challenge even the Iron Throne's seasoned forces. The rebels' ability to adapt quickly became legendary. Each setback was a lesson. Each victory was leveraged for greater strategic gains. One particularly striking example occurred during a winter siege near the Riverlands. Ned Stark's forces, outnumbered and freezing, held a vital bridge against the king's army, using the terrain and clever positioning to turn a desperate defense into a victory. Robert's aggressive campaigns complemented this perfectly. While Ned fortified positions and cut supply lines, Robert pressed forward relentlessly, leaving the royal army on the defensive. The morale of the rebel troops soared with every encounter. What began as vengeance for the Starks had grown into a movement, a symbol that no king, however mad, could rule without accountability. Meanwhile, the psychological impact on Aerys' forces was undeniable. They faced a man whose wrath could not be predicted, and another whose patience was unmatched, creating a sense of constant uncertainty. The rebels also mastered the art of propaganda. Victory songs, tales of bravery, and reports of Robert's hammer spreading doom bolstered their ranks and intimidated the opposition. In every region they passed, From the Stormlands to the Riverlands, people began to choose sides, not for loyalty, but for survival. The tide had shifted not because of numbers alone, but because the rebels had captured the hearts and minds of the realm. Even minor victories carried weight. Securing a single village meant access to food, shelter, and men, while undermining the royal army's logistics in subtle but effective ways. By the midpoint of the rebellion, Robert and Ned were no longer just leaders. They had become symbols of inevitability, living proof that Aerys' reign was weakening. Yet the cost of progress was heavy. Every gain came at the expense of bloodshed, and Robert himself began to feel the strain of personal loss mingled with the weight of command. The rebels also encountered the cruel realities of war. Peasants were caught in the crossfire, castles were burned, and once loyal knights began defecting under pressure. Despite these challenges, the movement held together. Discipline, strategy, and shared purpose forged an army capable of facing even the formidable royal forces. By the time they approached the Trident, the rebel army had become a force unlike any the Seven Kingdoms had seen in generations. It was disciplined, coordinated, and most importantly, confident. Every lord, soldier, and small folk follower now understood that they were part of something larger. This was not just a war for revenge, it was a rebellion reshaping the very nature of power in Westeros. Robert's hammer had become a legend in itself. Ned's patience and planning had created an unbreakable backbone. Together, they had transformed a collection of grievances and anger into an unstoppable tide. The turning of the tide was complete, and the rebel army now marched with purpose, confidence, and inevitability. The air above King's Landing shimmered with heat and fear. For months, the capital had been a cage, the mad king trapped inside, pacing like a cornered beast, his whispers of fire growing louder with each passing day. Outside the walls, the banners of House Lannister gleamed crimson and gold. Tywin Lannister, once the king's hand and now his executioner, had arrived with a promise of loyalty, and an army large enough to decide the war's end. Aerys, blind to treachery, ordered the gates opened. He believed Tywin had come to save him. But the lion had no interest in saving dragons. What followed was not a siege, but a slaughter. The Lannisters poured through the streets, cutting down defenders and looters alike. Smoke curled from the great sept, and the Red Keep echoed with screams. It was the sound of a dynasty dying. Within the throne room, madness reached its final crescendo. Aerys too demanded wildfire, to burn the city, to deny victory to his enemies. "Let it be ashes," he had whispered to his pyromancer. "Let them all burn." But before the flames could be unleashed, the doors burst open. Sir Jaime Lannister, golden and untested, entered the hall not as a knight, but as history's hand. He begged the king to surrender. Aerys turned, eyes gleaming with fury, and ordered the death of every citizen in King's Landing. Jaime made his choice. Steel flashed, and the mad king fell to his knees, a final breath escaping with the hiss of madness undone. When Robert's forces finally reached the city, they found it silent but for the crackle of burning homes. The Iron Throne, forged by conquest, was once again won by it. Robert Baratheon stood in the hall where dragons had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, his hammer slick with the blood of the past. He had claimed victory, but not peace. Far to the south, Elia Martell and her children lay slain. Far to the north, Ned Stark rode to a lonely tower where destiny awaited him in silence and shadow. The war was over, but its ghosts would haunt the realm for generations. For in the ashes of the dragon's fall, the game had only just begun. The war was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than the clash of swords. The 7 kingdoms had been drenched in blood, and though Robert Baratheon now sat upon the Iron Throne, peace did not come easily to men who had lost everything to win it. King's Landing still smelled of smoke. The dragon skulls in the Red Keep, once symbols of power, were now relics of extinction. In the throne room, Robert's laughter filled the air loud, defiant, but hollow beneath the weight of victory. He had won his crown, yet the woman he loved was gone. Far in the north, Eddard Stark rode beneath a gray sky. His banner hung low, his eyes darker still. The rebellion had made him a hero, but what he carried back from Dorne would turn him into something else entirely, a man of silence, bound by promises he could never speak aloud. At the Tower of Joy, amidst the broken stones and the whispers of dying men, Ned found Lyanna. Her strength had faded, but her voice, trembling and soft, still carried the gravity of fate. "Promise me, Ned." 3 words that chained a lifetime of honor to a secret of fire and blood. In the south, the Lannisters cemented their power. Cersei's golden hair caught the light of a new dawn, but her eyes looked toward the throne as though she had already begun to plan its fall. And in the deserts of Dorne, vengeance stirred. The Martells would not forget the screams that echoed from the Red Keep. The world had changed. The dragons were gone. The old gods and new seemed silent, and the realm tried to forget the madness that had nearly consumed it. But history, in Westeros, never stays buried. From the ashes of rebellion rose the seeds of another storm, a game of crowns, of betrayals, of bloodlines hidden in shadow. And as snow began to fall once more upon Winterfell's walls, a quiet truth lingered in the cold air. The war for the Iron Throne had only paused, not ended.